Hello, this is Ben Ruley with the Stearns County Soil and Water Office, and this is your Weekend Conservation Report. The last couple of weeks I have been out working with landowners on the Minnesota Buffer Law compliance. I thought this would be a good time to get out an update on where we are in Stearns County and what it took to get here. When the Minnesota State Legislature passed the Minnesota Buffer Law, it established that lands adjacent to waters defined in the Minnesota Public Waters Inventory would need a 50-foot vegetative buffer to be considered compliant. The Minnesota Public Water Inventory was defined in the late 70s, early 80s at the state's direction. Being that water is a resource important to all Minnesotans, the effort was to inventory and provide protection for the major waters of Minnesota. Lands adjacent to public ditches need a 16.5-foot buffer. The buffer would be measured from the top of the bank. The law also designated that local county soil and water offices would be required to provide information and assistance to landowners who had parcels that may have been out of compliance. Using aerial imagery, the Stearns County Soil and Water had to assess approximately 9,700 parcels on public waters and 2,000 parcels on public ditches. We ended up with around 400 parcels that looked to be missing the 50-foot buffer. For each of those parcels, we put together maps showing the areas that were missing the buffer and calculated acreages. These maps and a letter with additional buffer information was sent out to each landowner. Another big component with the Minnesota Buffer Law was something referred to as alternative practices. If a landowner requested, their SWCD office could come out and develop an individualized buffer plan for their parcel. The state provided guidelines for these plans. In areas where land was sloping away from the channel, a 16.5-foot buffer would be acceptable if the landowner was willing to provide protection around the open tile inlets and provide adequate protection around the pour points. In cases where there was positive slope, the SWCD would consider the NRCS filter strip tool, which would allow for a 30-foot buffer where we had smaller watersheds and flatter terrain. Of the approximately 300 landowners we spoke with, 169 requested alternative practice plans. Although the deadline for public buffers was on November 1st of 2017 and November 1st of 2018 for public ditch buffers, there were a number of extensions available to give landowners additional time who were working towards compliance. We have reached the end of those extensions, and there is some enforcement action starting with landowners that are still out of compliance. Luckily, in Stearns County, we are 99.7% compliant on public waters. That's only about 30 parcels left to get into compliance. Almost all of these landowners are currently working with the SWCD office to get into compliance and are planning to plant their buffers this fall when crops come off. There is a great chance that Stearns County will be close to 100% compliant by the end of this year. There are only 6 parcels on public ditches that are currently out of compliance in Stearns County, and those landowners are working with their watershed districts. If there is a case where a landowner is unwilling to comply with the Minnesota Buffer Law, enforcement is the responsibility of the Board of Water and Soil Resources in Stearns County. Once the Board of Water and Soil Resources starts an enforcement action on a parcel, the landowner has 11 months to get into compliance. After the 11-month grace period, there is the potential for financial penalty. The proposed fine is $100 per month per parcel for 6 months, and then $500 a month per parcel after that. The last thing I want to touch with is what else will be happening down the road. The buffer law requires that Soil and Waters monitor these buffers on a 3-year cycle for compliance. The SWCD will complete this process through review of aerial, photos, and roadside checks. In cases where we are unable to determine that the buffers comply with the law's requirements, the Soil and Water will contact landowners to schedule site visits. If you have any questions, feel free to contact the Stearns County Soil and Water Office at any time. Thank you and have a great weekend. This has been the Stearns County Conservation Report.